I am 60 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that being a good woman meant being quiet, agreeable, and endlessly available to everyone else. And if you are listening right now and feel a small tightening in your chest, then maybe part of you already knows this story is also about you, because my name is Nova, I am 60, and it took me a lifetime to understand that living for other people slowly erases who you really are, and I want to share this not as advice from a book, but as a lived experience. Because if someone had said these words to me when I was younger, my life might have looked very different. And before we go any further, if stories like this matter to you, stories about real life, quiet regrets, and honest realizations, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Wisdom After Regret, because this channel exists for moments exactly like this, moments when we pause and finally tell the truth to ourselves. And now let me take you back to the beginning, to the version of me who thought love was something you earned by disappearing. I grew up in a home where praise came only when I was useful, when I helped without being asked, when I stayed out of the way, when I smiled even if my feelings were hurt, and no one ever said it directly, but I learned early that my worth was tied to how comfortable I made everyone else feel, so I became very good at reading rooms, anticipating needs, and silencing my own voice, and people called me kind, dependable, and selfless, and those words felt like medals at the time, even though they were quietly chaining me to a life that was never really mine. As a young woman, I carried those lessons into every relationship, every job, every friendship, believing that if I tried harder, gave more, and asked for less, I would finally feel secure, finally feel loved. And when I married, I thought I was doing everything right, supporting my husband's dreams, adjusting my own expectations, telling myself that compromise was maturity and sacrifice was love, and for a while, I convinced myself that I was happy because I didn't know any other way to be. But happiness built on silence is fragile, and it cracks slowly, almost invisibly, like hairline fractures in glass, and I ignored the signs for years, the exhaustion that never fully went away, the quiet resentment that crept in when my needs were dismissed, the strange emptiness I felt even on good days, and whenever a small voice inside me whispered that something was wrong, I told it to be grateful, to stop complaining, to remember how lucky I was. I became a mother, and my world narrowed even further, because suddenly my entire identity revolved around taking care of everyone else, and don't misunderstand me, I loved my children deeply. But somewhere along the way, I stopped existing outside of what I could give, and every decision I made passed through the same filter: how will this affect them? Will this upset anyone? Is this too selfish? And slowly, without any dramatic moment, I forgot how to ask myself what I wanted at all. Years passed like this, filled with responsibilities, routines, and quiet compromises, and from the outside, my life looked stable, respectable, even successful in the way society defines success for women like me. But inside, I felt like a guest in my own life, always adjusting, always accommodating, never fully present, and the hardest part was that I didn't know how to explain this feeling to anyone, because I didn't have the language for it yet. I just knew I was tired in a way that sleep never fixed. There were moments, small and fleeting, when I almost broke the pattern, when I imagined a different version of myself, one who spoke honestly, who set boundaries, who said no without apologizing, but fear always pulled me back. Fear of being judged, fear of being called difficult, fear of disappointing the people who depended on me, and so I kept choosing what felt safe, even when safe was slowly suffocating me. By the time I reached my 40s, the gap between who I was and who I pretended to be had grown so wide that it hurt to look at it directly, and instead of confronting it, I worked harder, gave more, smiled wider, hoping that if I just did enough, the emptiness would eventually disappear on its own. But it never did. It only got quieter and heavier, like something pressing down on my chest that I learned to carry without complaint. I remember one evening clearly, standing alone in my kitchen after everyone had gone to bed, surrounded by the evidence of another day spent meeting other people's needs and suddenly realizing that no one had asked me how I was in a very long time, and what scared me more was that I wouldn't have known how to answer if they had, because I had spent so many years ignoring my own feelings that they felt unfamiliar, almost foreign. That night, I didn't cry dramatically or make any bold decisions. I just stood there, holding onto the counter, feeling an ache that I couldn't name yet. An ache that would follow me quietly for years before I finally understood what it was trying to tell me. If you're listening to this and thinking that this sounds uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know that you're not weak for feeling this way, and you're not alone, because many of us were taught that being good meant being invisible, that love was conditional, and that our needs were an inconvenience, and those lessons don't disappear just because time passes, they settle deep into the way we live. I wish I could tell you that I woke up one day and changed everything, that I had a sudden moment of clarity and reclaimed my life overnight. But the truth is much slower and much messier than that. And it didn't begin with confidence or courage. It began with exhaustion, the kind that strips away your ability to pretend, the kind that forces you to sit with truths you've been avoiding. By my late 50s, my children were grown, my marriage felt more like a partnership of habit than connection, and the roles that had once defined me no longer required the same constant attention, and instead of feeling relieved, I felt lost, because without those roles, I had no idea who I was, and that terrified me more than staying unhappy ever had. I started noticing how often I said yes when I meant no, how quickly I apologized for things that weren't my fault, how deeply uncomfortable I felt taking up space, expressing opinions, or prioritizing myself. And for the first time, I didn't push those observations away. I let them sit, heavy and uncomfortable, because something inside me knew that ignoring them had cost me too much already. This wasn't a dramatic rebellion. There were no ultimatums or sudden transformations, just a growing awareness that the life I had built around everyone else had left no room for me, and that if I didn't change something now, I would spend the rest of my years disappearing quietly, praised for my sacrifices, but empty inside. And so, at 60, standing at a crossroads I never expected to face, I began asking myself a question that felt almost dangerous in its simplicity. What would happen if I stopped living for other people, not out of anger or bitterness, but out of respect for the life I still had left? And that question, more than anything else, changed the direction of my story. But that part, the part where I finally started choosing myself, comes next. When I first allowed myself to seriously consider the idea of stopping living for other people, it didn't feel empowering or freeing the way social media makes it sound. It felt terrifying. Because when you've spent decades shaping yourself around other people's expectations, the thought of removing that shape feels like stepping into nothingness. And at 60, with more years behind me than ahead, the fear wasn't just about change, it was about regret. About realizing how much time I had already given away. My name is Nova, and for a long time, I believed that it was too late for me to learn how to live differently, that the patterns were too deep, that this was simply who I was, the woman who showed up, who stayed quiet, who carried everyone else's emotional weight without complaint. The first thing I noticed when I started paying attention was how uncomfortable silence made me. Especially silence where I didn't immediately rush in to fill the space, fix a problem, or make someone else feel better, because my value had always come from being useful, and without that usefulness, I felt exposed, like I had nothing to offer. I began experimenting in very small ways, not grand declarations, just moments where I paused before saying yes, moments where I let a request sit instead of immediately agreeing. And each time, my heart would race as if I were doing something wrong, something selfish, something dangerous. The guilt came quickly, sharp and familiar, whispering that I was letting people down, that I was becoming difficult, that I was changing in ways that wouldn't be liked. And there were times I almost retreated back into my old habits just to make that feeling stop. Because guilt, when you're used to it, can feel safer than uncertainty. What surprised me was that the world didn't collapse the way I had imagined it would. People were occasionally confused, sometimes disappointed, but life went on. And that realization was both relieving and painful, because it meant that all those years I spent shrinking myself to keep others comfortable were not as necessary as I had believed. I began to see how often I had assumed responsibility for other people's emotions, how quickly I blamed myself when someone else was unhappy, and how deeply that belief had shaped my choices, keeping me small, cautious, and quiet. There were difficult conversations, moments when my voice shook, when I felt clumsy and unsure, trying to express boundaries I had never practiced before. And I won't lie, some people didn't respond well, some reacted with irritation, others with subtle resistance, and a few with outright dismissal. And those moments hurt deeply, because they forced me to confront a painful truth that some relationships had only worked because I had been willing to disappear inside them. I remember one conversation in particular. Standing across from someone who had known me for years, hearing them say, half joking, half accusing, that I was different now, that I used to be easier, and instead of apologizing the way I always had, I felt a strange calm settle in my chest, because for the first time, I understood what that word meant, easier for whom, and at what cost to me. That moment didn't feel like victory, it felt like grief. Grieving the version of myself who believed her worth came from how little she needed, and grieving the years she spent mistaking endurance for love. As I continued this slow, uneven process of choosing myself in small ways, I noticed something else changing too. My body felt lighter, my thoughts clearer, as if I had been carrying a weight for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. And with that lightness came anger. Quiet but persistent. Anger at the messages I had absorbed, at the expectations placed on women like me, at the way self-sacrifice had been praised without question. For a while, that anger scared me because I had always associated it with being ungrateful or cruel, but I began to understand that it wasn't there to destroy anything, it was there to protect me, to signal where my boundaries had been crossed for too long. There were days when I doubted myself deeply, wondering if I was rewriting history to excuse selfishness, if this awakening was nothing more than a late life rebellion. And in those moments, I reminded myself that honoring my needs didn't erase my love for others. It simply placed my humanity alongside theirs instead of beneath it. I also had to face the reality that stopping living for other people didn't mean suddenly knowing how to live for myself. Because when you've spent a lifetime ignoring your own desires, they don't announce themselves clearly, they emerge slowly, quietly, through trial and error, through noticing what drains you and what restores you, through allowing yourself to be curious without immediately judging the result. I started asking myself simple questions: what feels right today? What feels heavy? What am I doing out of habit instead of choice? And those questions became a kind of compass, imperfect but honest, guiding me through unfamiliar territory. I spent more time alone, not in isolation, but in intentional solitude, listening to my own thoughts without immediately editing them for acceptability, and sometimes what I heard surprised me: opinions I had never voiced, preferences I had dismissed as unimportant, dreams I had buried under responsibility. This process wasn't neat or linear. There were days when I slipped back into old patterns, when I overextended myself, when I apologized unnecessarily. And instead of shaming myself for it, I tried something new: compassion, recognizing that unlearning a lifetime of conditioning takes time, especially at 60 when the grooves are deep and familiar. Through all of this, I kept returning to one quiet realization: that living for other people had given me a sense of purpose, but it had never given me peace. And peace, I was learning, comes from alignment, from living in a way that doesn't require you to constantly betray yourself. Sharing this story on Wisdom After Regret isn't about telling anyone what to do or how to live. It's about naming experiences that often go unspoken, especially for women who have been praised for their endurance rather than their fulfillment. And if you're listening and feeling seen, feeling unsettled, feeling curious, then this story is already doing its work. At 60, I didn't suddenly become fearless or confident, but I became honest. Honest about the cost of always putting myself last, honest about the resentment that silence breeds, and honest about the possibility that the years ahead, however many they are, could still belong to me in a way the years behind never did. And that honesty, more than anything else, became the foundation for the life I am still learning how to live. As the days passed, I began noticing the subtler shifts in my life, the ones that don't make headlines but quietly change everything. And I realized that stopping to live for others wasn't a single act, it was a continuous choice, a series of small, deliberate decisions to honor my own inner life. My name is Nova, and at 60, when most people assume that growth slows or stops, I found myself in a period of awakening, learning that identity isn't fixed, that self-respect isn't arrogance, and that peace doesn't require the approval of anyone else. The first thing I had to confront was loneliness, because when you stop bending to others' expectations, some relationships inevitably shift or fade, and the silence left behind can feel alarming at first. It is in those moments that I understood the difference between being alone and being lonely, the first nurturing and necessary, the second uncomfortable but instructive, and slowly I came to trust the quiet as a guide, noticing how my energy responded when I was free from obligation, when I could act without fear of judgment, when I could simply breathe and exist on my own terms. The world didn't end, and neither did people abandon me entirely, but I noticed patterns, the ones I had ignored for decades, friends who thrived on my constant availability, family members who expected endless patience, coworkers who assumed compliance, and it became increasingly clear that the cost of their comfort had been my own voice. I started reclaiming my voice, speaking up in subtle ways at first, correcting assumptions, declining requests I didn't want to fulfill, sharing opinions I had previously withheld, and each time I did, the ripple effect was surprising. Conversations shifted, people adjusted, and more often than not, respect quietly replaced resentment. It wasn't universal. Some relationships frayed, some people reacted with subtle judgment or mild irritation. But those were relationships built on my silence, and as painful as it was to see them change, I understood that their loss didn't diminish me, it clarified me. It highlighted the space that I had been denying myself. I began exploring passions I had set aside, small curiosities at first, hobbies I had dismissed, books I never read, walks I never took, and with each tiny choice, I discovered joy in the mundane, delight in discovery, and freedom in simply following curiosity without expectation. On Wisdom After Regret, I share this not as a guide to living recklessly, but as an invitation to consider the life we shape unconsciously around others, the weight we carry silently, and the liberation available when we start saying no in service of yes to ourselves. There were moments of fear too, mornings when the old anxieties would creep in, whispering that I was selfish, that I was ungrateful, that this path was unnatural, and yet, when I listened carefully, I realized that those whispers were the echoes of conditioning, not truth, and I began to notice that the more I trusted my instincts, the quieter the fear became. The internal dialogue shifted from doubt to curiosity, from guilt to investigation, and I learned to approach each day with questions: what feels nourishing, what feels draining, and what do I truly want to experience? It was astonishing to recognize how long I had ignored these basic inquiries, assuming that my needs were secondary, invisible, or less valid than everyone else's. And as I honored these needs, I felt my energy expand, my mood stabilize, my perspective widen, and an unexpected peace settle into the corners of my life that had long been tense with obligation. In parallel, I began noticing the way my choices affected those around me, not in the manipulative way of expecting gratitude, but in the organic way of modeling self-respect, teaching by example that life doesn't have to be a treadmill of sacrifice for the sake of acceptance. I had always thought that sacrifice equaled love, that selflessness was proof of virtue, but slowly, I saw that these beliefs were not universal, that my value was not contingent on my subjugation, and that true love and connection could coexist with boundaries. Some people initially struggled with this new nova, their expectations unprepared for the woman who could say no without apology, who could choose herself without shame, and it was in those moments I learned patience, both with others and with myself, realizing that internal change requires external accommodation. At 60, patience becomes wisdom, and wisdom becomes a compass guiding choices rather than a chain binding behavior. I also recognized the way social media and cultural messaging had reinforced my old patterns, showing curated lives and praising endurance, invisibly teaching women like me that sacrifice equaled achievement, that invisibility equaled approval, and that visibility equaled vanity. Rejecting those narratives was liberating and terrifying, because I had internalized them so completely, and the process of unlearning required me to question deeply ingrained notions of worth and morality. Slowly, I began to create routines that prioritized my well-being, from sleep and nutrition to mindful reflection, from creative expression to physical movement, and each routine reinforced a sense of autonomy I had never known. On Wisdom After Regret, I share these moments not to prescribe them, but to illustrate that no matter your age, claiming yourself is possible, and claiming yourself doesn't require abandoning kindness, empathy, or connection. It requires redefining them on your terms. One of the most powerful lessons was that freedom is not chaos, that choosing for oneself doesn't mean neglecting responsibility. It means integrating responsibility into a framework where I am equally considered. Conversations with family and friends gradually shifted from obligation-laden scripts to more genuine exchanges, where honesty replaced deference and curiosity replaced fear. And in those exchanges, I discovered a richer depth of connection than I had known when I was constantly performing to please. Some days, doubt returns, it always does, and I remind myself that doubt is not a failure, it is a signal to pause, reflect, and choose again. At 60, reflection becomes a gift rather than a burden, and the more I reflect, the more I understand the patterns I fell into, the societal conditioning I absorbed, and the opportunities I bypassed, and in naming these, I reclaim them. My story is messy, uneven, and deeply human, filled with hesitation, courage, failure, and triumph, and it serves as a living example on Wisdom After Regret that it is never too late to redirect the course of one's life, to prioritize oneself, to embrace the discomfort that accompanies growth, and to trust that every year lived is a canvas for self-discovery, self-compassion, and authenticity. And I invite anyone listening, watching, or reading to consider their own moments of small courage, to leave comments sharing how they started choosing themselves, to like and subscribe if this story resonates, and to share it with someone who needs to hear that living for yourself is not selfish, it is survival, it is reclamation, and it is, perhaps, the most profound act of love you can offer both yourself and the world. As I sit quietly now, reflecting on the journey that brought me here, I feel a sense of calm I had never known in my earlier decades. A calm that comes not from the absence of challenges but from the presence of choice, from finally understanding that at 60, life is not about pleasing everyone else, but about honoring your own path. I, Nova, want to share on Wisdom After Regret how radical it feels to stop living according to other people's timelines, expectations, and judgments, and instead craft a life that truly belongs to you. It begins with noticing the tiny ways you compromise yourself, the micro decisions you make daily that slowly accumulate into decades of ignoring your own desires, and the courage to begin reversing that pattern, even just a little each day, brings an unexpectedly profound sense of liberation. At first, the world resists, subtle friction arises, old patterns push back, but when you persist, the tension eases and clarity emerges, showing that your happiness, integrity, and fulfillment are not negotiable, they are yours to claim. I realized that people who truly care will adjust, while others who cannot accept your boundaries were never meant to be anchors in your life. It's astonishing how many hours, days, and years we spend validating ourselves through the eyes of others, and how radically different life feels when we stop doing that. I began to see every choice, what to say, what to do, where to go, and even how to spend quiet moments as a chance to reclaim ownership of my own story. The liberation is addictive, but also gentle, like a soft wind that clears away the dust of long-held obligations. On Wisdom After Regret, I share this so others may witness that it's never too late to choose themselves, to rewrite the script of their own lives. I started setting boundaries without guilt, pursuing interests without justification, laughing more freely, crying without shame, and feeling deeply alive for the first time in decades. Each day became an experiment in authenticity, each interaction an opportunity to see whether relationships were reciprocal or merely habit. And through this process, I discovered that the people who remain in your life after you claim yourself are those who truly deserve to be there. Even mistakes became lessons, even doubts became tools, and the fear of judgment slowly dissolved into acceptance of myself, of others, and of life's unpredictability. I invite anyone watching this to pause, reflect, and ask themselves, whose approval am I living for? And what small steps can I take today to honor my own heart? The answers are transformative, and the ripple effect can be profound, not just for you, but for the people around you. At 60, I finally stopped living for other people, and the freedom, peace, and joy I have discovered is something I never imagined possible. I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments. Like this video if it resonates. Subscribe to Wisdom After Regret for more stories and insights that help you navigate life's complexities, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that choosing themselves is not selfish but essential. Remember, living for yourself is an act of courage, a commitment to authenticity, and a gift to everyone who witnesses it. And with each day that passes, you can begin, at any age, to reclaim the life you deserve, celebrate yourself, and finally understand that your own voice is the most important one you'll ever need to hear.